Ever wonder what all the hype is about breath work? After all, it's just breathing right. How can it be so transformative, so powerful, so healing? Don't we just breathe every day? Hi everyone, Dr. Brad here. I'm not sure about you, but everywhere I look these days on the internet and social media, I keep seeing more and more people posting about breathing as a way to relax, to break free from anxiety and depression, to sleep better, and even to improve their relationships. Of course, that could just be my algorithm. But what is the big draw? If you know me as a naturopathic physician and biofeedback practitioner, my work has been informed and influenced on breathwork and somatic therapy. I've been teaching meditation and yoga for over 25 years. What many of you might not know are the details about my journey into the world of breathwork. In this video, I wanted to share with you some of the very profound, transformational experiences I had with breathing that opened my eyes to its power and benefits, shaping my life and my work. So if you're interested in hearing more about how breathing changed my life, and maybe be introduced to a few styles of breathwork along the way, take a seat, settle back, take a deep breath, and stick around. Hey everyone. A quick Google or Bing search for the word breathwork takes you down a web of names, books, exercises, and resources. The list is expansive. Of course, we have yogic pranayama, but we also have bioenergetics, Bateko, box breathing, coherent, circular clarity, conscious, connected, conscious, continuum, holotropic, holuronic, transformational, rebirthing, Wim Hof, and so many, many more. Even HRV biofeedback emphasizes the breath. Now, my path to breathwork was not a straight line. Perhaps you could say it began when I started studying Vipassana and mindfulness meditation as a teenager, where I practiced being present to the breath. When I breathe in, I feel myself breathe in. When I breathe out, I feel myself breathe out. That was the first time I actually focused on my breath in a particular way. Or perhaps my love of breathwork was grounded in being a musical theater kid. I distinctly remember several occasions feeling a tremendous high from singing, either in chorus or when performing in a high school show, or even in my car or around the house. But using the breath as a therapeutic tool, that intention didn't come until later. I'm rather embarrassed to admit that even my education as a naturopathic physician didn't teach me much about the biochemical and neurological aspects of breathing. My physical medicine curriculum in my training provided a foundation for understanding the biomechanics of breathing, but the full importance of diaphragmatic breathing, that wasn't discussed. During medical school, I decided to augment my coursework with additional training in craniosacral therapy and somatic therapies such as Feldenkrais, Alexander technique, and Hanasomatics. Somehow, I even managed to find time to take a month-long immersive daily Iyengar yoga training. Now, all these practices remind me that our life history is held in the body. Our orientation to the world, our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings are all interwoven within our tissues. And I started to learn how releasing and unwinding physical tension and restriction could change our entire life, including our thoughts and emotions. My direct exploration into the world of breathwork truly began after I graduated, sometime in the mid-1990s, when I was introduced to Reichian therapy. A colleague who trained in bodywork and Reichian therapy offered me a few sessions to experience firsthand his work. Now, I had heard of Reich. I knew he was a disciple of Freud who eventually severed ties and went his own way. What I found so appealing about Reich's work was his concept of character armor. As a means of protecting ourselves, as a way to be safe in the world, our body armors through muscular contraction, tightness, and rigidity. By releasing the tension in our body, we can release the armor and restore freedom and flow. After all my physical medicine training, this made perfect sense to me. At the time of my first session with my colleague, I was still thinking, though, purely on a physical plane. I hadn't even considered that releasing tension could affect my psycho-emotional or spiritual dimensions. So I was invited to think about an infant. My colleague said, "What's an infant's main mode of communication when it's born?" "Sound, crying." At birth, the baby can't even control its head or eye movements, but they can cry. And as most parents can attest, a cry is not just a cry. Many parents say that they can distinguish a cry of hunger versus a cry for comfort versus a cry of pain. And this brings us to one of the first places Reich says that we as humans armor, around the diaphragm. When a baby is crying because it needs food or love, support, or comfort, if no one responds, they learn that it's useless to express themselves. If their cries are met with aggression or hostility, a lack of tenderness or compassion, this further reinforces how unsafe it is to express needs, wants, fears, and desires. Better to be safe than sorry. Better to lock down anything that might lead to expression. Constrict the muscles that allow you to cry. Tighten the diaphragm. Now, Reich outlined other locks as well, but for my first session, we were going to examine this area. So with that theory out of the way, I was instructed to lie over a padded stool so that my back was arched, my arms were extended, my legs were out in front of me. Basically a supported back bend, a classic chest opener, much like you see here. Once in this position, I was instructed to do one thing: pant. Pant in and out through my mouth. Just pant. Take a full, deep, diaphragmatic breath, slowly increasing my respiration rate. But the speed wasn't the most important factor here. The full movement of the diaphragm was. So I started to pant. I had done a lot of pranayama at this point, so I wasn't totally unfamiliar with this, but I was instructed to keep going and going. I trusted my friend enough to follow his instructions, so I felt safe. I didn't have to worry about anything. He was my witness, my container for the experience, so I started to pant. Now, if I tightened or contracted any muscles, he would firmly press on them and invite me to soften into the area, yet maintain this breathing pattern. Not expecting much to happen, I continued to pant. Then after about 10 minutes, I felt a wave of energy rise up from my core and eventually fill my eyes with tears. And I started crying and crying and crying. I remember thinking to myself, why are you crying? I mean, nothing just happened. You're just breathing. No sad memories or images flashed across my mind, but this wave of energy continued to surge upward and out my mouth and eyes. At this point, I could no longer keep panting, and I was supportively transitioned off the stool and onto my side. Once everything settled, we processed the experience. Clearly, he said, I had some releasing to do. Had I been stifling and suppressing my self-expression all these years? My rational mind said, well, of course. A young gay boy who was taunted and teased in a steel town all of his life growing up, of course you stifled expression. But at the same time, I thought, I'm an open and proud adult now. I clearly speak my mind, right? This exercise provided me a chance to experience what it was like to melt some armor. By fatiguing the muscles around my diaphragm, fatiguing the muscles that stymied my expression, I was able to discharge. Now, nothing was said in that session about hyperventilation or its effect on the mind and body, and my understanding of that would come later. We met for another session, and we focused on my legs, and I experienced another huge wave of energy and discharge. I don't remember crying that time, but my breathing did become rapid and uncontrollable and deep. Again, the same principles applied. I was releasing locks and armor, and this one was connected to my sense of stability and security. For several days after both sessions, I was surprised by how calm I felt. The world looked different to me, clearer, cleaner. I was less reactive, more open, and able to express myself with ease. This didn't last, of course, since I was given no tools to practice this on my own. Once immersed back into my daily life, surrounded by all my familiar triggers and influences, the armor returned, if it ever really went away. After this experience, I was on a mission to learn more. I worked with a practitioner of bioenergetics, which was developed by Alexander Lowen, a student of Reich, and this practitioner guided me through similar breathing techniques. Once again, I felt an emotional release, followed by several days of calm, which gradually evaporated. I dove into pranayama and I studied an array of movement and somatic therapies, and in 1 year, I took workshops in Traeger, orthobiotomy, Hanasomatics, continuum movement therapy, Phoenix Rising yoga therapy, Gabriel Roth's 5 rhythms, and authentic movement. On the more psychological side, I studied focusing, Ikomi, and somatic experiencing. I was learning more about our body's innate intelligence, and I realized how overlooked it is in our healing journeys, at least in most conventional and even some psychological forms of healthcare. Now, my next profound experience with breathing occurred during my first continuum movement workshop. This particular workshop wasn't led by its founder, Emily Conrad. I took several workshops with her later. Now, continuum is a movement-based approach. So it utilizes sound and breath coupled with movement. Now, according to Emily Conrad, we don't do movement. We are movement. However, we have become so fixed and rigid physically and emotionally, mentally, and spiritually to the point that we no longer know how to move spontaneously and freely. All our movements have become socialized, and these imprints block the freedom of expression we are biologically capable of. The practice is to move out of our conditioned and habituated, linear, fixed movement patterns and adopt a more liquid, flow-like wave of moving. We were encouraged to surrender our rigid construct of our body as well. Rather than think of your arm as an arm, imagine it as seaweed, squid tentacle, jellyfish. Allow this wave not just to move through your skin, but your fascia, your muscles, your bone, your tendons, your ligaments. Remain curious and surprised by the movements that arise. So throughout this workshop, we played with numerous tones. We did sessions where we vocalized the sound O and E and I, and we allowed that sound to move throughout our body. Yet we continued to return to one specific breathing pattern, which had a very similar approach to Reiki and breathwork that I had been taught several years earlier. We were to breathe rapidly, fully, and deeply in and out through the mouth to get the diaphragm moving. To initiate a fluid movement, we would generate an impulse. We also generated impulses in our face, around our lips and mouth, and we were allowed to let that move throughout the body. And anytime we got lost in our process, we were to return to this breathing, to pump the diaphragm. Now, let me preemptively apologize to anyone in the continuum community who's watching this and takes issue with what I'm about to demonstrate. It has been years since I attended a formal training, and my memory is most likely colored by all my years of my own breathing and somatic practice. And it looks something like this. So we generate the breath, but we start to add fluid, wave-like motion. And we start in the lips, the mouth, and we let it travel throughout the body, looking something like this. So we keep the breath going, and we add this movement and wave of the muscles, and it just travels throughout the body. When a few of my fellow workshop attendees and I saw this initial demonstration, we made a mistake of commenting to the similarities of other styles of breathing like Kapalabhati or Reichian breathwork, and immediately our facilitator, Kim, shut us down saying, no, this is Emily's breathwork, this is continuum breathwork. And when I took a workshop with Emily Conrad several years later, I witnessed the same exchange. A participant made the same kind of remark, commenting on its similarities to other practices, and Emily quickly set her straight. But back to my profound experience. It was the third day of the workshop, and we were out in a retreat center in a cold, wintry western Massachusetts. I experienced during this time my first breathing trip. I mean, no drugs were required, just my lungs and a safe place to dive into my psyche. So it was our last session before dinner, around 3 p.m. It started off like all other sessions thus far. Powerful music is always played to help you carry you along on this wave-like state. So I'm lying on the floor with my eyes closed, and I began to breathe to initiate the fluid wave. And the next thing I knew, the bell rang, indicating that the practice was coming to a close, and we were invited to allow all the movements and the breath to slowly settle so that we could rest in stillness, sitting in open attention. And we were just to observe whatever was to arise. And I'm thinking, wow, that was really fast, but I guess it's almost time for dinner. I was disappointed that that was the main thing on my mind. Then the next thing I know, the final bell was rung, inviting us to finally open our eyes and look around the room. But I couldn't open my eyes. Suddenly I was overwhelmed by a sense of paralysis. I couldn't move, I couldn't talk. I remained motionless on the floor. The activity in the room began to increase as people began to speak and share about their experiences. Now, I don't know how or why, but I noticed the room got quiet again, and then I heard the voice of the facilitator, who seemed to be sitting right next to me at this point. During this entire time, there was a voice in my head yelling at me, saying, "It's dinner time. Everyone is watching you and waiting, so stop playing games, just open your eyes and get up." But it was no use. I could hear that voice. I couldn't even argue with it. I was just paralyzed. And over what I now know is about 40 minutes, I was guided to finally roll over onto my stomach, which took several minutes and a lot of effort. Next, I was instructed and guided and led to crawl, then to kneel, then to pull myself up, then to eventually stand. All of this done with my eyes closed, mind you. And after standing for some time, I was finally able to open my eyes and look around the room. And there in front of me, beaming, was the facilitator. And then my fellow co-participants rushed over to hug me and thank me for allowing them to witness this experience, as if I had a choice. I felt exhausted and disoriented, as if I had just lived my entire childhood motor development, relearning everything from crawling to walking. Explanations were given. I was releasing early childhood trauma, and quantum theories were loosely and inaccurately tossed about. Although I had yet to do a session of rebirthing, I heard how Leonard Orr, its founder, described reliving his entire birth process as he emerged from the waters of a hot tub, I believe, in Esalen, after some intense breathing practice. Is that what happened to me? Whatever the explanation, for the next several months I continued this dynamic and fluid breathing and movement practice. And I felt freer, more alive, more authentic, and better able to be myself, whatever that was. When I had my first holotropic breathwork session, I was surprised by many of the similarities to my already established practice. Stanislav Grof, who developed holotropic breathwork, had been studying the effects of psychedelics for years and was interested in finding additional ways to induce these altered states of consciousness. Through practice and experimentation, he created holotropic breathwork. Like many of the approaches I tried before, we were instructed to mouth breathe, diaphragmatically and fully, breathing into the belly. Just like continuum, music with a strong rhythmic beat was used. We were given eye masks, which was so much easier for me, at least, than keeping my eyes closed in order to prevent our attention from being pulled away by anything in our visual field. Whereas in continuum, we use the breath to help generate a wave-like movement. In this process, as in my Reichian session, we initiated the breathing pattern and then allowed for the spontaneous arising of movement. So whatever wanted to be expressed, whether it was a sound, a gesture, a word, a tone, all of those were invited to come out. Another interesting difference is that we had a sitter, a fellow workshop participant who would sit while we did the breathwork process, supporting us, containing us, and ensuring we were safe. I experienced something similar in authentic movement and a few other somatic approaches, and I found it very comforting and supportive. It seemed as if I felt safe enough to dive deeper into my own process. My first holotropic session was not as intense or transformational as I anticipated, which, of course, can be the issue as well, clinging to expectation. Still, my experience then and since have been decidedly positive, specifically feeling more and more connected and integrated, less reactive, more open. Afterwards, I seem to be better able to access my creativity and curiosity. I continue to delve into the study of breathwork and dividing the various schools and approaches into two basic camps. On the one side, you have the gentle, balancing approaches, and on the other, you have the vigorous, breakthrough approaches. Now, this is not to say you cannot or will not have a transformational experience with these gentler approaches. I have witnessed that hundreds of times. It's just that each of these seem to attract a different constitutional type. Each have different goals and intentions. And before embarking on a path, it helps to be clear as to your expectations. One of my personal challenges with most of the workshops and trainings I attended centered around the explanations they provided about what was happening. I would have much preferred facilitators to say, "We have no idea about what is happening, but here's our best guess." Then to speak with authority and say, "Well, the science shows." I hear that a lot. Science shows, especially when I come to learn that they never read the cited studies. Like when my good friend Kathy and I attended different yoga classes throughout Seattle every single Saturday for an entire year. Now, Kathy was a physician and taught anatomy, and she would cringe listening to the explanations by yoga teachers over the muscles involved in a particular asana. Our favorite teachers were the ones who, knowing she was a doctor and an anatomy teacher, would be open to discussion about the biomechanics of a posture. Now, I don't take issue with the idea of releasing physical and emotional blockages, or even the concept of energy or transpersonal states. Some of my challenges were around the biochemistry. Back in the 1990s, many of the breath workers taught that the brain was getting more oxygen in these vigorous approaches. Now, such a statement has widely fallen out of fashion, although just a month ago I heard a founder of a particular breathwork school describe how the healing occurs when your brain gets flooded with oxygen. This is just not the case, but back in the 1990s, I heard this frequently. So wanting to know more about certain types of breathwork and meditation practices and what they would do to the body, I decided to become certified in biofeedback. Now, biofeedback is where you attach sensors to the body to measure physiological processes like sweat, muscle tension, temperature of the extremities, your breathing rate, your heart rate, the constriction of your blood vessels, and even brain waves. Now, I could measure what was happening in real time to the body as I practiced various styles of breathing. Here is where I grew to understand the concept of hyperventilation even more and how it impacts the body, and discovered that most, if not all, of these vigorous breathing methods induce hyperventilation. And more importantly, inducing a hyperventilation state, even for a few minutes, is not safe for everyone. Simply put, hyperventilation is when we either breathe in excessive amounts of oxygen, breathe out excessive amounts of carbon dioxide, or both. So Reichian, continuum, holotropic, holuronic, Wim Hof, certain pranayama approaches, all of these induce hyperventilation. While oxygen levels in your bloodstream do increase, what is not true is that the oxygen makes its way to your brain and tissues. In fact, the opposite happens. When the blood is saturated with oxygen, the hemoglobin, which transports the oxygen to the tissues, holds on to it more tightly, making it unavailable to the tissues that need it. And the result? Blood vessels constrict, airways tighten, muscles spasm, and that cycle keeps going. Your body breathes more deeply and rapidly in an attempt to get more oxygen to the tissues, starving for it, but it doesn't. Now, think about a person having a panic attack. They're breathing heavily, over-breathing, rapidly taking in excessive amounts of air, getting a lot of oxygen in and blowing off a lot of carbon dioxide. And they can even describe the sensation, I'm not getting enough oxygen into their lungs, but that's actually not true. And so what do most people do when they have a panic attack? Not necessarily the most functional or safe approach, but they breathe into a paper bag, taking in more carbon dioxide, raising the levels of carbon dioxide, which balances the pH, and then the system seems to settle. So coldness, numbness or tingling of the fingertips, the lips, the tongue, lightheadedness and dizziness, all of these are symptoms that have been reported with these vigorous practices and are a direct result of hyperventilation. I now have the equipment to measure this. Rather than think in psychological terms like dissociation or difficulty focusing, this could be a primary result of the biochemical changes causing a decreased flow of blood in the brain. Because these blood flow changes can be extreme, vigorous breathing practices have several caveats, making them not appropriate for everyone. Hyperventilation is known to elicit seizures in people with a history of epilepsy. For those with cardiovascular disease, such as congestive heart failure or unmanaged hypertension, this could make the condition worse. If hypertension is currently managed effectively with medications, many breath workers are less concerned. Yet, as a doctor, I'm inclined to err on the side of caution and suggest that anyone interested in trying those approaches first have a conversation with your physician, provided that your physician is educated about the effects of breathing on blood pressure. Now, I have worked with many people with essential primary hypertension, and I've seen drastic reductions in blood pressure within minutes of gentle breathing practices, specifically called resonant or coherent breathing. However, with a daily home practice, without one, these changes aren't sustained. Now, people with asthma tend to be chronic hyperventilators, and vigorous breathing practices can trigger asthma, although I have witnessed the opposite in patients and colleagues who have seen their asthma almost miraculously disappear after one intense breathwork session. Again, I tend to use a gentler approach for people with asthma, either coherent breathing or in a combination of something with a longer exhale and an exhaled pause. While other contraindications exist, I want to come back to theory. Recently, the psychedelic as well as the holotropic breathwork communities have begun to talk about the default mode network in the brain as a rationale for its effect. The default mode network is a particular set of structures in the more recently developed neocortex. Speculation surrounds these regions in neuroscience, but typically the default mode network is described in terms of our ability to be self-referential and to think about short-term and long-term future. Now, in order to contemplate and plan for the future, we must be able to detach from this present moment experience and go elsewhere. On the one hand, the activity in the default mode network has been associated with planning and decision making. Some functional MRI studies have shown that meditators have an increase in activity here. On the other hand, an overactive default mode network has been found with excessive anxiety and worry, with an inner monologue of self-criticism and judgment, those who are continually future tripping, ruminating about a negative outcome and future. Psychedelic research has shown a decrease in the activity of the default mode network. Now, most likely due to blood flow changes resulting from hyperventilation, the same reduction in activity in the default mode network has been seen with holotropic breathing. When the default mode network goes offline, if you will, our boundaries and sense of self dissolve. How you make sense of the world, how you view yourself and your place in the world is gone. And you're free to experience yourself in new ways. You can experience an expansiveness. Psychologists and neuroscientists might call this ego dissolution, whereas yogis and meditators might call this a mystical or spiritual experience. I believe that one of the most important benefits that comes from vigorous breathing approaches involves desensitization. And this is often overlooked, or at least rarely mentioned, when I'm present. During these workshops, participants are repeatedly encouraged to remain with the breath, to stay with the process regardless. Take a panic attack as an example. Has anyone ever died from a panic attack? They might pass out from overbreathing, but typically they haven't died. They feel the sensations in the body and they misinterpret them as their default mode network perhaps begins to project something terrible happening in the near future. However, the mental, emotional, and physical sensations might be a result of hyperventilation. To be able to stay with the sensation, to listen to them, to adjust accordingly, can alleviate a great deal of suffering. But in the midst of the sensations, people typically do whatever they can to avoid the sensations. During these breathwork sessions, you are now being invited to stay with the sensation, to be with the process. You start to re-experience uncomfortable sensations, and as you stay with them, they begin to lose their power. As Robert Frost wrote, the way out is through. That may be the one central theme to all of my education and training, to go into our experience, to meet it, befriend it. We armor because we are so afraid of discomfort. We armor because we feel unsafe. Since breathing is both involuntary and voluntary, it is one of the easiest ways to manipulate and bring quick and sudden insight and change. I can begin to watch how I breathe in any given moment to determine how safe I feel in the world. If I long to have an open and engaged conversation with someone, do I hold my breath? Do I clam up? Or do I take a breath in and release it and smile and sigh, softening my belly in the process so that I can receive in the moment? I really enjoy some of the vigorous breathing practices, but that is not my starting point with most people. I believe a lot of people become over-attached to having this transformational experience, but then they go back into their daily life without any knowledge of how to breathe with ease. They seem to think that one experience will change them, and they fail to recognize that daily work is involved in sustaining it. So my personal approach is to teach everyone the basics of how to breathe in our body with ease, how to breathe effortlessly for free-flowing breath, so that any given moment you can come back to this one singular breath. So that's just a part of my healing journey in the world of breathwork. I've gone on to study other forms, and I keep coming back to the fact that learning to breathe gently, easily, effortlessly into the body can be extremely triggering, challenging, and healing for many people. So this is where I start in my breathwork process with people. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in learning more about breathwork and how we can use it to be more fully engaged with life, please contact me. Thank you for listening. And as always, may you go gently, knowing your goodness.